Welcome back to my channel. Today's episode we'll be reviewing the Unicorn Holy Grail of the Morgan Mouthpiece Refacing Kit. So don't forget to give a thumbs up, subscribe, and like and share afterwards. Now, first of all, this kit has not been available for well over 10 or maybe even 20 years, I think. It was available for a while from various places, and I bought mine from Forays, I believe it was over 20 years ago, now that I think about it. Myself, a close friend, and someone else bought one of the last three that they had in stock, just in time before they disappeared forever. Now, as you chat, I'll be showing you some documentation here, the original documentation, and also additional documentation that I have. Let me switch cameras and get right to it. We can review what's in the kit and everything else. And what we have here is the Morgan Refacing Kit and its instructions, the original instructions. Now, as I open this, I have some of my own feeler gauges in here. These are these. I will take these out, put them aside. And we have the Refacing Kit instructions. Comes with 0.05, 0.034, 0.024, 0.01, 0.0015 feeler gauges. And of course, it has the glass gauge. And then the tip feeler gauge right here. This mentions everything is made from top grade materials that they have. The feeler gauge is from ground tool steel stock. And it also mentions other common items you want. A thick plate glass for flat surface. Wet dry cutting paper gives you some specific items here, 4 and 600 grit. Half round second cut files, 4-inch flat files, second cut, also 4-inch. Good supply of junk or hard rubber mouthpieces to learn. One of the main things it mentions here is you have to have a perfectly flat table for the mouthpiece, or at least close to it. And one of the main reasons is when you do use the gauges and feeler gauges, is if your table isn't flat, the glass gauge isn't going to fit flat at all. It's going to move around. So if you push in the back, it could open up a bit. If you push it up front, it could close down a bit. If it's not equal left to right, you're going to have it skew to the side. So you really have to make sure that one of the first things you learn about is flattening the table. And one of the other critical things about flattening the table is you may not get it totally flat. This example here, if we take a look, you'll see in the light right here, this is a dip in the table. As you learn about flattening tables and doing the curves, there's points where you don't want to keep flattening the table and losing the height of the table, and where you got most of it flat in just little sections like this, you just don't want to take too far down, because the more you take it down, of course, because the more you flatten the table to get rid of all these spots, the less tip you have now in relation to that table. And remember, the way you learn to flatten the table, if you don't flatten it perfectly, say this is a table here, if you say this is basically the surface here would be a sandpaper. If you don't do it flat, you'll end up creating an artificial curve from the table to the mouthpiece. Or if you cut it too much like this, you'll get rid of the curve at the top of the curve here. And everything changes dimensions. You really have to learn to create a flat table, and you have to learn when to cut your losses. And if there's sections that are just too deep to flatten because of some quality of the mouthpiece, you just make sure that most of it is flat. In this case, this won't affect much. Some mouthpieces you may have a section here that the whole section goes in. And depending upon where you put your ligature, your reed could be bent this way because you're pushing it down here and you're bending the reed out. It makes it play differently. And if you change the ligature where you put it, depending upon marks like portions like this, it could make the reed play completely differently. All these things you have to take in consideration when you flatten tables in relation to everything else with the mouthpiece. But let's just keep going on here. Talks about flattening the table over here and how to do it. And that's the key there, is you also want to make sure when you do flatten a table, you have to learn what's a good place to hold the mouthpiece for you, where you lightly but can still put pressure down on the mouthpiece. I'll let you read this. If you zoom into it, hit pause, you can see things. Talks about cutting things, correct position on the glass and mouthpiece. This is about positioning the glass itself on the mouthpiece and getting it just right up here. Watching these lines here, watching lines at the tip, getting up on the tip, and like that. That allows you to take a feeler gauge. This is one of the original ones over here. We'll take the 0.01 inch, which is 2.5 millimeters. And you got to learn to put it in the gauge lightly. If you use too much force, you can easily push it down more than it should be. And you're lifting the glass off of the table, off the flat table. And if you push it down however you want to do it, you can easily kind of make it the way you push it in there. Like, oh, that's it. No, this is it. You have to learn to really be light about it. Just kind of have it go in and see what happens. You may want to feel it, do a couple times. This isn't an instantaneously, oh, I know how to do this. You got to get the feel of it. Bingo. It's not too hard. You have to not be in a hurry. You have to use very light pressures. That's the whole thing. Talked about feeler gauge being low on one side, showing you the curve isn't correct. We put curve numbers into spreadsheets. Talks about cutting the facing curve over here. You'll see measure consistent schedule are 6 in number for saxes, 5 for clarinet mouthpieces. Each feeler gauge is determined a number representative of its stopping place in the glass gauge, as we have here. You see feeler gauges here, actual measures, and it talks on and on. Here it talks about cutting the table and talks about cutting the facing curve. That's where when you have it on the facing curve, you're cutting it and you're moving up pressures for control and going like this, starting there and curve. One of the things you have to make sure when you start learning this is from your table transition to the curve transition, you want to make sure there's no little ledge there. Many times people will learn to cut the table and then they'll think of the curve afterwards and they'll leave a little itty bitty ledge there, which the reed's going to react, because the reed's going to shunt straight forward and not bend. And then you'll end up not having the reed itself interface well with the mouthpiece. There's many ways to screw it up. Of course, you got to learn how to do it properly. It goes on talking about cutting and everything and using the feeler gauge. We'll do that right now. We're going to line this up, make sure it's in the middle. You can see this is curved. Now, the same thing with this gauge as with the other feeler gauges is you want to learn to be able to put it in there lightly. Because there's a point when it starts scraping, you feel it, you can actually push this in all the way. If you just push a little bit too hard, you can see that I push the glass open. The glass is open all the way down here, at least. You know, so it's all about touch, having a light touch and being able to feel that you just hit the top and the bottom. Bingo, right there. It's all about light touches, learning to be light and trying to be perfect. Trying to improve your process to be better, lighter, more accurate, and learning it takes time. Over here, it talks about if you were to grind it down too much, you can grind down a mouthpiece that has, you can grind down a mouthpiece that has a really thin table, and you can grind it down, you know, a couple millimeters, have a wider table, but then it also cuts into your mouthpiece and everything. Like I mentioned before, with the table example here, we have this little shiny spot that's a dip in the mouthpiece table. We can't do anything about that. That's too much of a dip. It was too much of a dip for me to consider flattening the table anymore to take care of that. Here's another mouthpiece with the same thing. You can see a little dip in the table here. It was just too much. And you can actually use a electronic one, you can actually measure the amount of dip in some of these things. Not much, but you can see there's a big dip there. You can see the space between there. So sometimes these are measurable, and I don't know, that's just a manufacturing issue. This is a Cowworth Jazz piece, and ironically, this is the Cowworth Classic piece. These are plastic injection molding. I'm going to guess that they're probably injection molded, and one position was right here, and it caused an issue. And then it had some little shrinkage there where it just kind of sucked it into the spot. That's a guess from me. Anyways, you can see the instructions from here, more information about it. Starting with a light sandpaper, going to a more finer grit. You can also use more finer grit than this. I start at 800 and go up. Shows you some information about some mouthpieces here, a Gregory alto, a Selmer tenor again, link tenor, Selmer baritone, and also conversion chart for you. Back here talks about parts of the mouthpiece. Ralph Morgan saxophone, their mouthpieces they have here, what the openings are, tip openings, reed suggestions. And more information about them right there. Now, if you manage to get one of these kits and not the instructions, the Eric Brand manual, which you can still get from Forays, actually has a lot of information about it in there. I think it's page 117 or 171. There it is. Talks about mouthpiece work here. This is a good book to learn about it. You may not have the equipment. You may want to get one of these first. Talks about, guess what? This was designed off the Morgan Mouthpiecing Gauge kit. Talks about parts of refacing, how you want to reface things, figure out the curve and everything. How to gauge your mouthpiece facing. Basically replicating everything in the Morgan instructions themselves. So this will be the first thing. And if you notice down here, this is really good. Shows you what happens with feeler gauges. This is what you're trying to correct most of the time, is unbalanced sidewalls on the mouthpiece. They may come at an angle or whatever, and you got to learn how to correct these. Of course, when you correct it, you want to take off as little material as possible. That's the whole thing with mouthpieces, is if you're just correcting the mouthpiece as it is and not really redesigning the tip or anything, the opening, you want to make as little correction as possible. Goes through here. This probably talks about selection abrasions that you use. This actually uses lighter 180 and 320. I use 800 and above, really, truthfully. So you can read about this, cutting down rubber mouthpieces, cutting down glass mouthpieces, lapping the table, how to hold it once again. Teaching you how to cut the curve. And a special caution, which I just mentioned, is taking too much material at one time. You want to take as little as possible. You want to kind of plan what you're doing. Like I mentioned with these ones I have here in the reflection, I can show it has a deep segment here that you just can't do anything about. You'll take away too much material off the table for such a little spot. Matter of fact, if anything, you may want to consider putting some epoxy in there and just flattening it out. But I use those for actually samples. It goes further on polishing lay. You can also polish things. Like I mentioned, I use, like 1600 grit paper, which is good for polishing. You can also actually polish it too. Trimming side rails to shape and everything. About buffing, proper shape of the tip, top view, symmetric rails, symmetric tip rail at the baffle area. Talks how to remedy common mouthpiece troubles up here. General suggestions, how to clean mouthpieces. Now, this is an old manual. Some of these suggestions in here would not fly nowadays. And let me tell you why. I believe this tells you to use, yeah, here we go. One of the solutions, it says to use muriatic acid and water. Basically, 1/4 muriatic acid to 3/4 water. I highly recommend against that. Muriatic acid is usually used for cleaning like concrete. That's what I use it for. Not to be used in a closed environment. Definitely not be used in a closed environment. And definitely not be used for this anymore. This may have held true 40 years ago and more, but not today. But it gives ideas how to do things. Talks about gilding trademarks. The stuff I showed on the clarinet before, you can do the same thing in mouthpieces. I've done that myself, and I continue to do that. Rubber's a little bit easier than wood. You can actually cut out an emblem a little bit easier to make it a deeper inset for the gilding material. Now here's an example of a metal mouthpiece. And I use the metal one and the sun one because it's normally silver plated. It's silver plate over copper. And you can see how this one has had baffle work and how the rails were made more even. You can see that because of the discoloration up here. You can see the copper underneath the silver plate because it was worn away from the refacing, and then the baffle work. This is a older Selmer scroll mouthpiece in E series, and it's a jazz one. So we have the flat table going into the throat. The flat table going right into the throat. Really bright mouthpiece. You can push this thing like crazy, and you can, strip the paint off the walls with this thing. You can definitely tell the difference between this and a classical mouthpiece. If you can't, there's something wrong with the ears or your embouchure. This is an original Morgan Mouthpiece. I think one of the last sets that he made, I bought it from a friend. And I haven't had this open in a while. I need to clean this, holy cow. One of the last sets that he made for tenor. It is a really nice mouthpiece. I don't use it very much. But Morgan Mouthpiece, 6C tenor. Really nice mouthpiece. You can see that's the serial number. It's cut and the sulfur basically is exposed to the air, and it's kind of corroding the rest of the stuff around it. That's interesting. I haven't used this for probably 6 years. Of course, you can guess the table and everything is perfect on this. Great mouthpiece. But there we go. A real quick review of the Morgan Mouthpiece Refacing Kit. Its instructions, additional instructions you can get if you manage to get your hands on one of those and not the instructions. That's really all I wanted to review today was the Morgan Mouthpiece Refacing Kit, because they're hard to get a hold of. They have been making them for decades and doubt they'll make them anymore. Anyways, thank you for listening. Any questions or comments, please put them down below. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. You gotta love knowledge, gotta love life, gotta love refacing mouthpieces. So we'll see you next time.